Hello, Anne-Marie. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me, Annabelle. I'm very excited to be here today.
Can you present yourself, please?
Of course. So my name is Anne-Marie Boulanger. I am a French to English translator. I live here in Montreal, and I have been translating for about 25 years now already. I'm a member of ATIAC. But in the past 5 years or so, I have gotten into translating children's books. I call it my day job. My day job is medical translation, and I specialize in medical and life sciences translation. But I've developed a passion for translating literature. So I've translated a novel and some short stories for adults, and I have translated already over 50 titles for kids. So it's really I've discovered that I really love doing it, and so that's where we are. That's where we are today.
So, how do you translate books? Like, what are key considerations when translating children's book to ensure it's appropriate?
I think the important things to consider is that you really have to match the tone and the style and the age range of the source book, right? If the source book is written in a humoristic, funny tone, you have to match that in the target language. You can't produce something that falls flat or doesn't reproduce any of the jokes. If it's serious, you have to maintain that tone. If it's whimsical, etc. So it's really important to really match the not only transmit the message, of course, you have to transmit the message accurately, but to also match all those elements. So the tone, the style, and the age range of the source book. Rhymes and wordplay and humor are tricky. You do have to preserve them, but the thing is that especially with rhymes, they can end up being the target text can end up being quite different from the source text, but as long as you preserve the spirit and the essence, I think you're still okay. For example, I translated a book about a crab. So, the French might talk about the crab à la mer or sur la plage. Well, if sea or beach doesn't work with your rhyme in English, you might use ocean or shore. As long as you convey the same message, you can vary the words. You really, it's important, of course, in any type of translation. You can't be we all know that you can't be literal. You can't translate the text word for word, but it's especially important in children's books. I translated one recently where um it was a book that mentioned fairy tale characters, and it talked about réponse in French, which is Rapunzel in English. And so in French, they had Réponse's prince was named Prince Question, like Question, question réponse. And I was like, oh my goodness, how am I going to translate this? So I ended up, playing around with it for a good amount of time. And finally, I said, okay, I have to get away. Obviously, that question answer thing doesn't work. So I went with, hair. How can I bring the notion of hair into the prince's name? So I ended up calling him Prince Locksley, like a lock of hair. So, and the publisher was really happy with it. So, you have to, you have leeway, obviously, when it comes to things like that. You can't translate them literally, or the message just doesn't get across. So yeah, that's the expressions. You also have like idioms, sometimes that come up, and you have to find the equivalent that works in your target language. So yeah, but you have to reproduce those elements. If there's been a wordplay or a joke made, you have to reproduce something in the target language.
How do translators approach translating cultural nuances and references in children's book to make them relatable to different backgrounds?
Those can be tricky as well. There's really a fine line I've noticed after, translating enough titles, and from different cultures and for different, I've translated books for the US, which isn't drastically culturally different from us, but there's still differences, right? And there's really a fine line. I noticed that we walk between foreignization and domestication. So we don't want to leave in so many foreign elements that it alienates the reader, but we also don't want to domesticate. We don't want to take away those cultural references so that the source text is completely unrecognizable, right? So we kind of have to tread that line. So for example, in Fanny Cloutier, of course, the character is from Quebec. She's from Montreal. She ends up in a small town, somewhere near Quebec City. And there are mentions of cultural elements from Quebec, obviously, things like store names, Canadian Tire and L'Abbé. And there's a mention of, French song titles. There's a French song title by Céline Dion and several other French artists, Cœur de Pirate and things like that. So I was like, what am I going to do with these? So in the end, I was translating it for an American audience, and we decided that the names of the stores, for example, didn't really have any relevance. So we kind of neutralized those to become like Canadian Tire became the hardware store and L'Abbé became the department store. For Celine Dion, the song title, I was able to change it to an English song title. I changed it to My Heart Will Go On, the Titanic song that everybody knows everywhere around the world, because the song title had no bearing on the story. So you're able to make adaptations like that don't strip away any of the culture of the source text. But there was a mention in Fanny Cloutier about poutine, and the editor wasn't quite sure what it was, and she wanted to say, I think, fries with gravy, and I said, no, no, poutine is not just fries with gravy. I'm like, this is like a quintessential Quebec dish. Like it's emblematic of Quebec. We have to keep in poutine. And, I actually sent her like supporting arguments of restaurants in like London and New York and who serve poutine. And, Gordon Ramsay, one of the most famous chefs in the world, had a recipe for poutine. So I said, it's known around the world. And I said, I don't think we can erase poutine. And in the end, it stayed in the book. Yes. So yeah, you have to you have to tread lightly around cultural references. Like I said, you don't want to erase them because it makes the characters who they are. But at the same time, you want the readers to be able to see themselves in the characters, right? So it's a balancing act. It's really a balancing act. If you're translating a book about a character from a cultural community or a different country, you can't erase that, right? So there are some elements, cultural references and elements that have to stay in. If they're central to the plot and to the essence of the character, then they have to stay in. And I also believe that even little children shouldn't be spoon-fed when it comes to what they're reading. Everything that they read that is read to them is a teaching opportunity. It's a learning opportunity. So even if they have to stop us and say, Mom or Dad, what does this mean? I think that's only a positive experience.
So we talked about translation, words, etc. But what role do illustrations play in translated children's book?
Right. So illustrations are a must. Visuals are a must. I won't even consider translating a book, a children's book, unless I have the visuals. Because, if there's no pictures, there's no context. Very often the words are describing what's going on in the pictures. And there's a few examples I have. I remember translating a book about dinosaurs. And the particular dinosaur that I was translating about, after I did my research, I found out that the dinosaur didn't match the picture. It was something like, I think I discovered that it had three horns, but the picture was only showing it as having two horns, or it was supposed to have plates on its back, and the picture had a sail on its back. It didn't match. So I had to point it out to the publisher, and they actually had the graphic designer alter the image to match the text. So yeah, it is really, really important. And I've translated a couple of graphic novels recently. And there were sound effects in the book. That's a challenge too. You wouldn't think so, but sound effects need to be translated, and they represent them visually. They'll put like zip, like ZIIP, or poof, like in French it's often, poof would be POUF. In English it's POOF. Or they would write things like tick tack, and for a clock, the sound of a clock ticking. Well, in English it's tick tock. So you have to, I actually had to pay attention to the visual representations of the sound effects and translate many of those sound effects. So no, illustrations are really, really fundamental to, first of all, to helping you understand the text. A lot of what's said in children's books is said visually. The words are there are much fewer words in a children's book than in an adult book. Like, the descriptions can be very lengthy in adult books, right? And you can picture it in your head, but children's books rely heavily on the illustrations. So in order to say what you need to say in the translation in as few words as possible, you need that illustration for context. And it's funny, I translated a book, a picture book, it was about Christmas, and it had to do with Santa Claus, and he called a meeting of the council of holiday characters or something. So there was like the Easter Bunny was there, the Tooth Fairy, there were various characters there. And I never noticed this when I was translating it, but when I was reading the book to my son, there was a fish, and he said, "Mummy, what holiday has to do with a fish?" And it suddenly hit me, and I went, "Oh my God, Poisson d'avril." And I went, I never caught this while I was translating. And now there's this random fish in the holiday council.
Are there ethical considerations when translating children's book, especially in terms of cultural sensitivity and representation?
Some that came to mind, especially when translating the Fanny Cloutier novels, is well, first of all, her name. In French, she's named Fanny, of course. In English, you may have noticed that her name was changed to Franny. And there's a reason for that, is because although Fanny is a very common French name, girl's French name, in English, in the US, your fanny is your backside. And in the UK, it's something even more unmentionable. Woman's private parts. It's the slang word for that. So there was no question that her name had to be changed for an English market. And Franny was the closest that we could find. And I think, everybody was fine with that. The author was fine with it. They understood. And I don't think that it didn't really affect the outcome or the content of the book in any way. We're not censors, right? You can't really, our job isn't necessarily to tone it down, but we also have to be mindful of how it's going to be received in the target audience.
Did you keep some dialogues in French? Like I saw books that are bilingual, that they speak French and they have like a note at the end of the page saying like the translation in English. But
So she meets a character who, in the original book, is the son of diplomats. So he's grown up, he's moved all over the world and he's been exposed to English. He obviously speaks English. So in the original book, he speaks French, but he peppers English into his dialogue. So in English, I did the opposite. I had him speaking English, but I put in, little interjections of French. We can't erase this bilingualism of him, of his character. Makes him who he is. So yeah, there's little bits and pieces of French that got retained throughout the book, and I think it's important. I think it gives the book flavor. And like I said, it lets the readers know, even in a foreign country, where this book came from and the culture from which it was written.
and do you have strategies you use to capture the voice and personality of the characters in your children's book?
Yeah, so I like to think of it as method acting, like you put yourself into you really channel the character, and with Franny in particular, I was once a 14-year-old girl. It seems like a long time ago now, but I was a 14-year-old girl who kept a diary, who had crushes on boys, who had fights with her best friend, and it's relatable. So I was really able to sort of remember and get in touch with how she would have felt, and reimagine myself at that age. So what helps me too is reading out loud. I like to read the text, my translations out loud, for the rhythm and the musicality, and just see if there's any sort of awkward turns of phrases that don't work. It helps to read comparable books too, just to get a sense of what authors, how authors are saying things, especially in the target language. Don't read translations, read original writing in the language that you're translating into, to get a feel for how children's book authors write, because there's styles, there are particular distinctive styles. I'm not saying copy them, but they can be, they can be a great source of inspiration.
Do you read it to your kids?
I do. I have a live-in beta reader, I call him. Actually, he was reading the entry in the animal book last night on hummingbirds, and he says hummingbirds consume the equivalent of their body weight, and he's like, huh? He's like, what does that mean? And I just thought to myself, okay, maybe I failed. Maybe that was a fail. I should have, reworded that to a more age appropriate language. But but yeah, he's helped me sort of catch issues before I've submitted the books to the publishers. So that's a lot of fun. And it's really cool. It's really rewarding to see, my own child reading books that I've translated.
How does the age group of the target audience influence the translation choice?
It's mostly vocabulary choices and writing style. So if I'm translating a board book, for example, for toddlers, the language has to be very simple. It has to be, short words that they're able to understand. Middle grade, picture books for sort of 4 to 7 or 8-year olds. The sentences they have to be short. They can't be anything complex or elaborate with a bunch of, clauses and dependent clauses, which I notice sometimes Quebec authors tend to do. Their sentences can be quite long. So what I tend to do as the translator is I shorten up those sentences. I take one long sentence and I sometimes break it down into two sentences to make it shorter. Um, so yeah, it's mostly language choices. So making sure that the way I say things and the words that I use are going to be understandable and are going to resonate with the young readers, whatever age they may be.
And do you prefer like young adult books or like children's books?
I like at least, the element of a story. Like board books are cute, they're fun, like for toddlers, but there's not much to them, right? Like they're just sort of colors, shapes, numbers, and but I like when you start getting into the sort of, age 6, 7, 8, when you can actually start telling a story and start using language that is maybe a little bit more complex. Um, so I have done the two Franny Cloutier novels. I would really love to translate another young adult novel that has maybe, deals with maybe a little bit more of a complex or, important or serious issue. Haven't found the right one yet, but hopefully, hopefully a project like that will come along.
The steps to translate a children's book. Is it different from other translation?
I'll read it from start to finish. I'll get a feel for it. Um, I'll identify any issues that I think might be tricky or problematic, like rhymes or wordplay or jokes, characters' names. Sometimes, very often, those editors ask me to translate those as well. Names that are more French. Things like Noemi might become Naomi, or Mathieu might become Matthew. They generally don't have an issue adapting characters' names for the target audience. So I'll identify uh, anything like that I need to double check with the editor, ask them how they want certain things approached. And then, I just jump into it. I translate, I do a draft. I generally do a quick draft. Sometimes I'll even dictate my translation. And then that's when I, go over it and begin the editing, the self-revising, I find takes longer. For me, it takes longer than the actual translation process. Um, so yeah, that's generally my process. And then I'll try to let it sit for, a couple of days, and then I'll reread it. I use the read aloud feature. Either I'll read it out loud, but I'll also have my computer read it back to me. And I always have like a second pair of eyes. Usually my assistant will reread it, or I've enlisted my mother. My mother has been my beta reader for Franny and my adult novels. So anything, because sometimes you get so close to the text that you don't see the issues anymore. So it helps to have definitely an outside pair of eyes, reread and catch any potential issues. I do like a search. I'll say, okay, how many times have I said this particular word in the text? And can I vary it like in any of these locations? Can I use another word? Or, have I spelled this word correctly everywhere? I have to use this US spelling. I have to be mindful of like measurements, like in Franny, she described everything in kilometers. Well, I had to make the conversion and talk about everything in miles. So yeah, there's that sort of added layer of bearing in mind that you're translating for a different culture.
Can you share any memorable experiences or insights for translating children's book?
I think the coolest thing that has happened to me so far is my son and I were in the Indigo upstairs in the children's section, and all of a sudden I hear, Mommy, Mommy, it's your book. And there on one of the tables, as an Indigo favorite, was a book called Planet Earth that I had translated for Édition Petit Génie, which is Shoebox Media in English. So it had been chosen by Indigo as one of their favorites, and it was there on an easel on a table in the middle of the floor. And that was really cool. I call it spotting your books in the wild when you sometimes come across your translations. And yeah, it's rewarding. You know, you feel like, ah, my work has paid off, and there's a little bit of recognition there, and people are enjoying them, right? That's what brings me enjoyment, is knowing that those books are reaching another audience, other countries, other readers. So that's really satisfying for me. And I'm very, proud and excited to say that my name is on the front cover of the Franny Cloutier books. Um, Oftentimes on kids' books, your name does appear, but it's usually on the title page or the back of the book. But yeah, there's more and more awareness, I think, now surrounding the fact that translators' names deserve to be on the cover, the front cover. I've met a couple of the authors too of books that I've translated, and that's been fun. They're always really grateful, and they're like, "Oh, you did such a good job. Thank you so much for getting my book out there." And I won't say who, but I had an author tell me, I think I sound, to be very honest with you, I think I sound better in English. To me, that was like the highest form of flattery. I was like, wow, like, the that particular author was really, really pleased and really impressed with how I had rendered their words, their work into English. So that was a big honor for me.
Thank you so much for participating on this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. As you can tell, I love talking about translating children's books. So thank you. Thank you for giving me this platform and for asking me all these wonderful questions. I am on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I also am on Instagram. So I reserve Instagram for things that are book related. I don't post on there as frequently as LinkedIn, but I try to save Instagram for things that are, literary translation related. So I would be happy for, anyone to follow me on Instagram, and of course to reach out on LinkedIn.